Don't lose heart while you're waiting for the Lord's perfect timing. And listen, even Jesus Christ had to wait for the Father's perfect timing. In John chapter 2, verse 4, Jesus said, "My hour has not yet come." And you see that throughout the Gospel of John. His hour had not yet come. His time had not yet come. Jesus was waiting for his hour to come. Jesus is in heaven right now, seated at the right hand of the Father, waiting for the Father to give him the command to go and claim his bride, the church. Jesus waited. Jesus is waiting. Joseph was waiting for his hour to come. And in chapter 41, his hour finally comes. God raises him up. But it's at the end of 2 additional years in prison. And we're told in verse 1, the circumstances here, Pharaoh had a dream. Behold, he stood by a river. That would be the Nile River in Egypt, verse 2. And suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat. I don't know if I'd ever describe a cow as fine-looking, but... And they fed in the meadow. And then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up in the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. And so Pharaoh woke up from his sleep. And then he fell back asleep in verse 5. And he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted, note, by the east wind, sprang up after them. The east wind was a hot, dry desert wind that came out of the Arabian Peninsula that would burn up the crops. I point that out just because it shows the accuracy of the Bible. It's got the geography right. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. But Pharaoh realized it was more than just a couple strange dreams. And so verse 8, now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, all the king's horses and all the king's men, right? He gets all the experts gathered together. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, I've mentioned this before when we were in chapter 40. The Egyptians actually had these dream interpretation books. Archaeologists have found several of them that they would use to interpret dreams. They kept these books in their pagan temples, and the magicians and the wise men and the Egyptian priests would reference these books and use them to try to interpret dreams. But we're told here the Egyptian magicians and wise men, they couldn't interpret Pharaoh's dream. There's nothing in the books about 7 skinny cows eating 7 fat cows. Nothing in the books about, blighted grain devouring healthy, plump heads of grain. So they don't have an answer for him. Now, we know that God was speaking to Pharaoh through these dreams, that these are supernatural dreams from God. They're prophetic dreams to communicate to Pharaoh what is to come over the next 14 years in Egypt. So verse 9 says, Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. This is all from chapter 40, as you remember. We each had a dream in one night, he and I, and each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there. He was a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged the other. And so as this is taking place, and Pharaoh's bothered by these dreams, and the wise men and the magicians, they can't come up with an interpretation, suddenly the butler remembers 2 years ago when he was in that prison. And he says, hey, I just remembered. When I was in prison, there was this Hebrew guy there, and he could interpret dreams. And so, verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. They shaved Joseph not only to clean him up and make him look presentable before he goes in before Pharaoh, but also to make him look Egyptian. The Egyptians were the only people in the ancient Near East that were clean shaven. They shaved their heads, they shaved their faces, they shaved their bodies. And so they shave him. And now Joseph goes in before Pharaoh. And I'm willing to bet that Joseph didn't expect this to happen this particular day, right? It's a day like any other day. He's in prison, sitting in his jail cell, watching The Price is Right or whatever you would do. And now suddenly, the next thing he knows, he's on his way to Pharaoh's palace. It's amazing how God can change your situation in just a moment when you're not even looking for it. God just sovereignly moves. And next thing you know, you're heading to Pharaoh's palace. Verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Now look at verse 16. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I love Joseph's answer here. Think about Joseph's situation. It would have been so easy for Joseph to use this as an opportunity to boast in himself and try to impress Pharaoh to get himself out of prison. He could have easily said, well, Pharaoh, I'm glad you brought up the fact that I interpret dreams. I do, in fact, interpret dreams. And by the way, I recently started a YouTube channel. You can subscribe and make sure you ring the little bell, your Pharaohness or whatever. Look at Joseph's answer. Pharaoh says, hey, I've heard you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says, no, I'm not able to, but God can. I can't do it, but God can do it for you. It's not in me, but God will give you the answer. Joseph points Pharaoh to God. Joseph points Pharaoh to God. And oh, that we would be like Joseph and point people to Jesus Christ at every opportunity. I'm sorry, I can't help you, but Jesus can help you. I don't have the answer for you, but Jesus has the answer. Jesus can give you peace.